What I will do now is introduce my book as a whole. I'll start by talking about why I wrote the book in terms of three broad areas of scholarship I sought to contribute to in writing it. Secondly, I'll talk you through the what of the book with a brief summary of some of the key arguments in the 7 chapters. And thirdly, I'd like to draw out just one of the many surprises that emerged for me in researching and writing the book, namely what I interpret as Dante's implicit confession of sloth and prodigality through Statius, whom I see as his moral cypher. So I've prepared a kind of Dantean lunchtime sandwich, a slice of bread, about 10 minutes on why I wrote the book, then the meat or some suitable vegetarian or vegan alternative, about 10 minutes on the what the book is about, and then another slice of bread, 10 minutes on who. Who is Dante? Who is Statius? Some surprises. So first of all, why I wrote the book. One of the really pleasurable things about contemporary Dante scholarship in the UK, and also obviously in Italy and Europe as a whole and internationally, is increasing collegiality and collaboration. The sense of a truly shared endeavor, a collective scholarly enterprise. And in researching and writing this book, I was consciously seeking to contribute something useful and potentially interesting to 3 broad directions in contemporary Dante scholarship. With my focus on Dante's ethics and on his moral theology then, I aim to contribute to a wider reappraisal of Dante's theology and of Dante as a poeta theologus, a poet theologian, who created his own extraordinary synthesis of the theological, philosophical, and cultural materials and resources available in his time, and who presented this poetic synthesis as von Balthasar's first lay theologian in the vernacular to a new public audience. A deeply influential strand of Dante's scholarship, however, has downplayed theological and ethical considerations. Most famously, Benedetto Croce is a reference point for those who sought or who seek to salvage the poetic from the doctrinal and ethical in Dante's poem, the scholar Pat Boyd remarking that Benedetto Croce managed to persuade a whole generation of critics that the ideological framework and content of the comedy had proved an obstacle to the free expression of Dante's poetic genius. In my book, then, I seek to reappraise the Commedia as Dante originally intended it, as a work of ethics, as he says in the Epistola to Can Grande, a work of morale negotium sive etica. Its stated purpose being to lead people from the misery of sin and direct them to the beatitude of heaven. I argue that Dante's primary aim in writing the Commedia was not to produce an innovative depiction of the 3 realms of the Christian afterlife, nor to write a poetic masterpiece for Christendom to rival the epics of classical antiquity, albeit he is justly celebrated, of course, for achieving both these goals. Rather, Dante's imaginative vision and poetic genius served more important ethical and political goals to transform people's moral lives and to reform the institutions that governed them. And I also seek to demonstrate in the book that this rebalancing in favor of the ethical actually serves to accentuate, nonetheless, our very appreciation of Dante's eschatological originality and literary brilliance. A second related area of scholarship, which I sought to contribute to with this book, is the reinvestigation of Dante's intellectual formation and sources. And here, a key contribution is my study of the practical context of lived Christianity and not just the high theology of the schools. In particular, a major argument of my book is that Dante's Purgatory is principally influenced by a tradition of moral and pastoral theology on the vices and virtues, epitomized by William Paraldus's De Vitis et Virtutibus, rather than by the influential reforms in Christian moral theory and practice of his Dominican successor, Aquinas. One of the high points of my research was discovering that Pietro d'Alighieri, in his third extended commentary, returns with ever more insistence on Paraldus's treatise, quoting sections at length to gloss his father's poem. Where the scholar Sigrid Wenzel, who had used Pietro's first commentary on his father's poem, so he wrote 3 commentaries, had effectively pointed out the influence of Paraldus on Dante's moral rationale for purgatory, I was able to demonstrate Paraldus' deeper influence over the moral content and form of Dante's Purgatory as a whole. Whether in relation to Dante's choice of exemplar on the Terrace of Pride, or his particular treatment of prodigality and indiscreet zeal, the opposing subvices of avarice and sloth, respectively, Paraldus's De Vitis undergirds, I argue in this book, Dante's poetic treatment. In reading Paraldus and Dante side by side, even what might have seemed like inconsequential details or simply descriptive adjectives in Dante's poetry began to take on much broader cultural and spiritual resonances. This recontextualization of Dante's poem in the penitential and preaching materials from which, at least in part, it emerged, was then one of the most exciting things for me in my research. The third area of scholarship to which I sought to contribute is the re-examination of the narrative structure of Dante's poem and of how we read Dante. My research for the book coincided with 2 collaborative projects in the UK. Here in St Andrews, the Lectura Dantis Andrepolitana, the first full-length Lectura Dantis in the UK, organised by my colleagues in Italian, Robert Wilson and Claudia Rosignoli, is innovative also by typically giving a whole day in which 4 scholars read and comment upon 4 cantos in a row, a practice which opens up the horizontal, longer narrative structures of the poem. Vertical readings in Dante's Comedy, 2012 to 2016, a collaborative reappraisal of Dante's Commedia that I organised with my colleague in Cambridge, Heather Webb, explored systematically the vertical correspondences between cantos of the same number in the 3 canticles. So starting with Inferno 1, Purgatory 1 and Paradiso, and then moving to Inferno 2, Purgatorio 2, Paradiso 2, etc. In my book, I show the interpretative value of reading the Commedia through its moral structure. Less necessary for the Inferno, where one canto frequently aligns in any case with one moral region or sub-region. This approach, I argue, is vital for Purgatorio and Paradiso, where moral regions such as terraces or planetary heavens become more important and invariably encompass a series of cantos. I found more specifically that reading 3 moral regions of Dante's Purgatory, the terraces of pride, sloth, and avarice, as narrative structural units, opened up new perspectives on individual cantos as well as on particular interpretative creatures within them. And I believe that this methodological approach could be fruitfully applied to the poem as a whole. So, by focusing on Dante as a moral theologian, his poem as a work of ethics, my book seeks to contribute to the current reappraisal of Dante as poeta theologus, of his Commedia as a work of theology. My research on the penitential and preaching context of Dante, and especially my close study of Paraldus's De Vitis et Virtutibus, seeks to contribute to the reinvestigation of Dante's intellectual formation and sources. And my analysis of the poem through its moral structure seeks to contribute to a rethinking of Dante's compositional process and of the narrative structure of his poem. Let me now turn to the what of the book, the meat or falafel of our lunchtime sandwich, and give a brief summary of each of the chapters in turn. As I mentioned in the beginning of chapter 1, one argument of my book is that Dante employs different moral criteria for the three canticles. I argue that Dante clearly distinguished in his poem, as in his prose works, between natural ethics and Christian ethics, and that this is profoundly connected to his political theology. Dante believed that man has two ethical goals: a this worldly happiness achievable through the teachings of the philosophers and the natural virtues, and a heavenly goal, beatitude, achievable through the Christian virtues, and that the global institutions of empire and church are divinely ordered to facilitate these two ethical journeys. A striking feature then of Dante's depiction of hell is that Dante organizes his ethical material explicitly according to philosophical principles. The authority is Aristotle, whose ethics, physics, and arguably also metaphysics are cited by Dante. There's been a huge amount of scholarship on the moral structure of hell, which is particularly complex. In chapter 1, I argue that Dante's rationale, articulated by Virgil in Inferno Canto 11, is consistent and effectively demarcates the four main regions of hell: sins of incontinence, of violence, of fraud, and of treachery. Even the three anomalies omitted from Virgil's account, the neutrals, the limbo of the virtuous pagans, and the heretics, and here Dante singles out for a special emphasis the Epicureans, serve, I suggest, to reinforce at an allegorical level the Aristotelian moral structure of the whole. Thus, the neutrals on the near shore of Acheron may embody pusillanimity, the virtuous pagans, Aristotle's understanding of a heroic virtue. As you will have seen, if you've had a chance to glance through the chapter, I also analyse the moral structures of Dante's Purgatory and Paradise in this chapter, as well as addressing at its close the issue of Dante's portrayal and placement of women in the poem. In the second chapter, I explore the political implications of Dante's ethics. I argue that we should see the poem at this political level as an incendiary manifesto for the reform of the church, stripped of all material possessions, in a political theology that is more extreme in some respects, even than that of the spiritual Franciscans, and that Dante is advocating for a revival of Holy Roman Empire holding universal temporal jurisdiction. No less than his Latin prose treatise in 3 books, De Monarchia, publicly burnt in 1326, only 5 years after his death by the papal legate, who also threatened to disinter and incinerate Dante's bodily remains. Thankfully, that didn't happen. Dante's vernacular poem in 3 canticles puts forward a messianic theological political program that was potent ammunition to the imperial cause in the Italian peninsula and beyond. So in the first part of the book, chapters 1 and 2, I present overviews of Dante's ethics, chapter 1, and of his radical political theology, chapter 2. In the second part, chapters 3 and 4, I turn to focus on Dante's Purgatory, where I argue we find his distinctively Christian ethics. In chapter 3, I set out the broad pastoral and theological context for Dante's depiction of purgatory. The increasing ecclesial emphasis on preaching and penance, annual confession was first made obligatory at the Fourth Lateran Council, 1215-16, emerged in tandem with the increasing emphasis in the 13th century on the theology of purgatory, formalized as a dogma at the Council of Lyon in 1274. Although theologians underlined how unsatisfactory the moral system of the 7 capital vices or 7 deadly sins is in many ways as a structure for the Christian moral life, preachers discovered that it was pastorally effective. This was a system people could remember, and following Gregory, it was possible to map the whole morass of moral evil onto this skeleton structure. Dante then transforms what was familiar ethical material on the seven capital vices onto the relatively unfamiliar territory of purgatory. Almost without exception, scholars and commentators gloss Dante's approach to the seven capital vices in purgatory through the lens of Aquinas, and especially the Aquinas of the Summa Theologiae. However, Aquinas' reforms in moral theology were not, in fact, particularly influential in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. More influential, instead, was an older tradition on the vices represented by Aquinas' Dominican predecessor, Peraldus, who was born around 1200 and died in 1271. In chapter 4, I argue that it is to this older tradition that Dante turns in constructing the seven terraces of purgatory. I demonstrate the major differences between Aquinas' and Peraldus' approaches to the seven capital vices. And this comparative critique highlights the characteristics, including what I see as the weaknesses of Dante's poetic treatment, which clearly follows Peraldus' treatise. So the third and fourth chapters, part 2 of the book, lay the foundation then for part 3, chapters 5 to 7, which draw significantly on Peraldus' treatise as a gloss for the Christian ethics of Dante's Purgatory. While I provide an overview of all 7 capital vices in chapters 1 and 3, I focus here in detail on 3 vices: pride, chapter 5, sloth, chapter 6, and avarice, chapter 7. And this for a number of reasons. First, I seek to demonstrate the benefits of reading Dante's Purgatory through the narrative units of its moral structure, and providing such close reading required selection. Second, Dante gives special emphasis to these 3 vices in purgatory. Pride and avarice are both root vices from which the other vices may spring, and Dante allots considerable space, 3 and 3.5 cantos respectively, to the 2 terraces devoted to them. The terrace of sloth, although shorter, is structurally prominent as the midpoint of the poem and the central terrace to which Dante assigns the exposition on the order of love upon which purgatory is founded. Third, these 3 vices are representative of 3 different kinds of vice as characterized by human moral psychology. Pride with envy is a vice of the intellect. Sloth with wrath is a vice of the irascible appetite. And avarice with gluttony and lust is a vice of the concupiscible appetite. Fourth, sloth and avarice are the twin vices that Dante associates especially with the moral corruption of the church. It is the spiritual sloth and worldly avarice of the clergy which had led, in Dante's view, to the confounding of the 2 swords of temporal and spiritual power and to the consequent disorder of the world. And finally, Dante explicitly identifies pride as one of his own gravest vices, while, as I discovered, much to my excitement and surprise, he implicitly identifies prodigality, the opposing sub-vice of avarice, and sloth as key autobiographical vices through Statius, his moral cypher. So this brings me to the third part of my talk, the second slice of bread wrapping up my avocado sandwich. I had not intended to focus on the autobiographical dimension of Dante's Christian ethics in Purgatory. My intention was primarily to show here the influence of Peraldus rather than Aquinas. But this confessional dimension emerged particularly strongly for me during my research and is something I bring out more fully in the book's conclusion. Like King David, Dante is, of course, a sinner turned singer, a penitent preacher, a teacher of Christian ethics, who also represents in his poem his own personal journey of salvation from the misery of sin to the joys of heaven. Where the wrath of Achilles provides the narrative impetus for Homer's Iliad, and Virgil sings of Aeneas's exile from Troy and subsequent founding of Rome, it is Dante's sin and moral failings that orient his own epic narrative. What were then Dante's key moral failings? What were Dante's cardinal vices? Dante gives an explicit confession of pride on the second terrace of envy, and it is therefore understandable why this vice is most commonly associated by scholars with the poet. Strikingly though, and in clear structural parallel, Dante represents the poet Statius confessing to Sloth on the fifth terrace of Avarice. There is, however, no evidence for the historical Statius having been a prodigal or slothful. Dante simply makes this up. Not only that, Dante quantifies Statius's sins exactly. Dante has Statius confess that he did 500 years in purgatory for prodigality. I who have lain in this sorrow 500 years and more, and 400 years for sloth. And this tepidity had me circling the fourth circle beyond the 4th century. As Statius died in 96 AD, and the poem is set in 1300 AD, this leaves little more than 300 years for Statius's stints on the terraces of pride, envy, and wrath, as well as anti-purgatory combined. Why does Dante invent Statius's prodigality and sloth? Why does he, uniquely for the inhabitants of his afterlife, quantify Statius's sins so carefully? And why does he explicitly specify that prodigality was Statius's dominant vice as a pagan? A passage from Virgil's Aeneid showed Statius the error of his prodigal ways, while specifying that sloth was Statius's dominant vice as a Christian after his, invented by Dante, conversion to Christianity. I argue that Dante deliberately constructs his representation of Statius as a moral cypher. In other words, Dante is confessing to the vices of prodigality and sloth through the figure of Statius. For now, I'll just give a brief glimpse of why I became convinced that this might indeed be the case. And the full arguments for this, on first sight rather surprising interpretation, are in chapters 6 and 7 of my book, towards the ends of those 2 chapters. So, first, what of Statius and Dante's prodigality? As readers of the poem know, Statius's prodigality comes as a dramatic surprise. On the terrace of Sloth, Virgil is perplexed that Statius, a wise poet, could have succumbed to the particularly vulgar vice of avarice. How could avarice find a place within your breast among such wisdom with which your studies had filled you? Now, what I show is that Dante sets up a structural parallel here between this episode in the Terrace of Sloth and an equally important episode in Limbo, Inferno 4. In Limbo, Dante character, having just been overthrown by the she-wolf of Avarice in Inferno 1, is nonetheless accepted by the 5 great classical poets, Homer, Horace, Ovid, Lucan, and Virgil, as the 6th amongst such wisdom. In both episodes, Dante uses the exact same triple rhyme, ceno, feno, seno, which is very rare. Statius's smile and Virgil's greeting in the Terrace of Sloth exactly parallel Virgil's smile and the greeting of Virgil's poetic company in Limbo. Most notably, the line, so that I was 6th amongst such wisdom, si che io fui sesto traco tanto seno, in Limbo, becomes, in the Terrace of Sloth, loco avarizia tra cotanto seno, avarice a place amongst such wisdom. What I argue then is that we as readers should have been as surprised that Dante's character, overthrown by the she-wolf of avarice, should nonetheless have been accepted as the sixth amongst such wisdom in limbo, as Virgil is surprised on the Terrace of Sloth that avarice should have found a place in Statius amongst such wisdom. Statius's explanation for having spent so long on the Terrace of Avarice, 500 years, is also finally then, albeit at a figural level, Dante's explanation to his reader for having been overthrown by the she-wolf of avarice in Inferno 1. Your question shows me that you believe that I was avaricious in the other life, perhaps because of that circle where I was. Know then that avarice was too distant from me, and thousands of months have punished this lack of measure. As it turns out, neither Statius nor by implication Dante was guilty of the species avarice after all, but rather of a subspecies of the genus avarice, namely the opposing subvice of prodigality. Dante clearly had a horror, a moral horror of avarice, but it was a commonplace that in reacting excessively against a vice, one was liable to fall prey to its opposite. Moreover, prodigality is singled out, as for example by Brunetto Latini in Il Tresor, as the paradigmatic example of an opposing vice which is nonetheless very close to the mean virtue, in this case, liberality. As an excess in generosity and giving, prodigality suggests a much more noble disposition than avarice. Perhaps most significantly, the vice of prodigality also associates Statius and Dante, as I demonstrate, with the most celebrated saint of his time, Saint Francis of Assisi, Saint Francis of Assisi. What finally then of Statius and Dante's Sloth? My reading of Peraldus was here again crucial. I demonstrate that not only does Dante follow Peraldus in identifying tepidity as the first species of sloth from which the other subvices flow, but he also names or alludes to 13 of the 17 subvices of sloth delineated by Peraldus in his treatise. Sloth is, for Peraldus, a vice particularly associated with the contemplative life. And as an exiled scholar and poet, it seems plausible that Dante struggled against the pull of this vice, a struggle I argue in chapter 6 that Dante dramatizes in his own person on the Terrace of Sloth. By attributing tepidity, sloth, to Statius as his post-conversion vice, Dante also seems, midway through writing the Commedia, so Dante is writing this section of the Purgatory around 1310 to 1315, he dies in 1321, Dante seems to be registering the danger, the very real danger, of leaving his own work through sloth incomplete, just as Statius, the delayer, and Dante plays in the tradition of nomen significans rei on the Latin status, waiting, delaying, Statius, just as Statius failed to complete the Achillead. There is even good reason to believe that Dante character's very first sin, his first moral failing at the beginning of his journey in Inferno 1, is sloth. For before Dante even encounters the three beasts, he had tried and failed to ascend the delightful hill of virtue and holiness. What stopped him? After I had a little rested my weary body, I took my way again along the deserted slope, so that my halted foot was always the lower. Si che il pie fermo era il più basso. On the Terrace of Sloth, Virgil upbraids Dante, informing him that the soul walks not only by love, but with the other foot, con altro piede, of the intellect. Dante's stationary foot, then, is the pes affectus. At the beginning of his ascent up the mountain, Dante character's love is deficient, holding him back from pursuing the upwards path of holiness directed by his intellect, the pes intellectus. Dante, in other words, exhibits the vice of tepidity, the love of the good that falls short of its proper duty. Via Peraldus, I even identify Dante's first sin more precisely as the sub-vice of ignavia, the slothful vice of a person who chooses to remain in great misery rather than to undertake the work necessary to escape it. As Peraldus writes, after he has placed one foot, that is of his intellect or good intention, in the path of holiness, the other foot of his affection or his action, he delays moving off for 2 years or even more, remaining in vice from the sloth of moving that foot. So it's only after that initial moral failure of sloth, though, that Dante character is assailed famously by the three beasts, by the other vices, turning back to the dark wood or perilous sea of sin. Strikingly, Peraldus's remedy for a tepid love of God, the consideration of future pain and eternal reward, becomes in effect Beatrice's remedy via Virgil for Dante character, to show him the desperate cries of the damned, those content in the fire of purgatory and the blessed in heaven. We might say in this sense that the whole of Dante's poem is a remedy for tepidity, a remedy for the lukewarm love of God. So I hope this third part of my talk, focusing on just one of the surprises that emerged for me during my research, the identification of Statius as a moral cypher for Dante and sloth and prodigality as key autobiographical vices, may also be an example of the interpretative fruitfulness of my more general approach in the book, which I discussed in the first part, in focusing on Dante's ethics, his moral theology, on Peraldus as a gloss, and on the narrative structures of the poem.